It was the kind of night that could have felt ordinary if it weren't for the weight of his absence. We had been together for almost a year, and for most of that time, I had convinced myself that we were just two people who happened to be in love, like anyone else. But that night, standing in the dimly lit corner of a coffee shop, I realized something that shook me to my core. This was the moment everything would change. The kind of shift you never see coming, like the thunderclap that splits the sky without warning. I didn't expect it then, not in that way. I thought I had already figured us out. We were sitting across from each other, the usual comfortable silence settling between us when his phone buzzed. It was almost a reflex for him. He glanced at the screen and then looked back at me, but this time there was something different in his eyes. Something heavy. My stomach churned, a sudden anxiety creeping up my spine. He hesitated for a moment before he excused himself to the restroom, leaving me to stare at the cup in my hands, suddenly unsure of everything. My mind raced, filling in gaps with the worst possibilities. I tried to push those thoughts away, telling myself that I was just being paranoid. But there was no denying the way he had looked at the phone, how the energy in the room shifted when it buzzed again, almost like a secret was unfolding without me. I was trying to keep myself calm, trying to breathe and ground myself, but the unease grew stronger the longer he stayed in the restroom. I couldn't sit still anymore, so I stood up and went to the counter to order something else. As I turned back toward our table, I froze. He was there, standing by the window, his back to me. His face was unreadable, but I could tell something was wrong. That's when it happened. He turned to face me, and the words that came out of his mouth shattered everything I thought I knew about us. "I need to tell you something," he said, voice trembling. "I didn't want to keep it from you, but it feels like I'm living a lie." My heart dropped, and I swear for a moment the world stopped spinning. He was different, like a person I didn't recognize. The words that followed were nothing I could have prepared myself for. He confessed something so raw, so deep, I felt like the floor had been ripped out from under me. He was still processing it himself, still coming to terms with something he'd been hiding for years. His feelings for me weren't just love. They were something more profound, something complicated. He wasn't just in love with me. He was in love with me in a way that I couldn't yet understand, not completely. And the bombshell, he hadn't been entirely honest with me about who he was, about his journey. I was part of his story, but not the way I thought. There was a part of him, a secret side, a whole life, that I had never even touched. A life that now, in this moment, seemed to be colliding with everything we had built together. I stood there, frozen. My mind couldn't catch up. I wanted to scream, to cry, to demand answers. But his eyes, they weren't the eyes of someone guilty or afraid. They were the eyes of someone who had just realized something too, something they couldn't unsee even if they wanted to. And that's when it hit me. The reason I felt so blindsided was because I had been blind all along. This wasn't just his secret, it was ours. His vulnerability had finally shattered the walls between us, revealing the truth we had both been avoiding. This moment, as painful as it was the moment I realized everything between us had just changed. Forever. I couldn't move. I stood there, the words he had just said echoing in my mind like a broken record, unable to make sense of them. I had always believed that love, the kind of love we had, was simple, something you could easily define. I had been wrong. He wasn't just saying he loved me in the way I'd thought. He was unraveling the very fabric of everything we had, turning it into something I couldn't comprehend. His eyes, searching mine for some kind of answer, began to blur with the sheen of tears that he was desperately trying to hold back. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice trembling like a leaf caught in a storm. But there was no anger, no blame in his tone, just sorrow, as if the weight of what he was saying was too much for either of us to bear. I wanted to say something, anything, but the words wouldn't come. How could I speak when everything I thought I knew about him, about us, was dissolving before my eyes? I couldn't even recognize the man standing in front of me. He was still the person I had fallen for, but he wasn't the same. There was this painful, raw honesty in the air, something that felt like it belonged to another version of us, a version that didn't yet exist. I kept replaying his words in my mind. "I'm not who you think I am." I had always seen him as my anchor, the one constant I could rely on in this unpredictable world, and now he was telling me that the foundation beneath my feet was cracked beyond repair. How had I missed it? How had I not seen this storm brewing in the quiet spaces between us? Then, as if fate was toying with me, another bombshell dropped. I noticed from the corner of my eye the familiar face of a woman walking past the coffee shop window, glancing inside with a casual, almost amused expression. I couldn't place her at first, but the look on her face, something about it, it felt familiar, like a puzzle piece I had seen before but hadn't yet connected. And then it clicked. The woman was someone I had seen before a few months ago when we had attended a mutual friend's birthday party. She was with him then, but at the time I didn't think much of it, just a passing acquaintance. But now, with everything unraveling, my mind raced, trying to make sense of the connection. I turned to him, my voice barely a whisper. "Who is she?" His face paled, and for a moment he looked as if he had been caught in a lie. But this wasn't a lie, not really. "She's someone from my past," he said, his voice cracking with emotion. "Someone I haven't been able to let go of. I didn't want to drag you into it, but I can't pretend anymore. She's part of who I am, too." The room felt like it was spinning. The woman in the window wasn't just an acquaintance. She was a ghost from his past, one that was still haunting him. The weight of the moment crushed me, and for the first time in our relationship, I realized that I wasn't just in love with the person he was. I was also in love with a version of him that no longer existed, a version that was being buried under the weight of his own secrets. My heart twisted in my chest. Everything I thought I knew was slipping away, and yet there was this pull, this undeniable connection I couldn't shake, no matter how hard I tried. I should have walked away. I should have told him I couldn't handle it, that I wasn't strong enough to carry the weight of his past and the uncertainty of our future. But instead, I stayed. I stayed because in that moment I realized something that hit me even harder than the shock of his confession. I wasn't just in love with the man I thought he was. I was in love with the truth, the raw, painful truth he had just laid bare before me. This was the real him, no longer hiding in the shadows. And maybe, just maybe, that was the one thing that had the power to change everything between us. The silence between us hung heavily in the air, thick with unsaid words, and for a moment I wondered if I had made a mistake. The truth had been revealed, but it didn't feel like liberation. Instead, it felt like a tether that had bound us both in ways neither of us understood. His face was still etched with the sorrow of his confession, his eyes desperate for any sign that I would still see him as the person he had always wanted to be. But could I? Could I still love him after everything he had just shared? The storm inside me was raging, a mix of hurt, confusion, and a strange kind of empathy. The truth was, I wasn't sure what I was supposed to feel in that moment. I watched him closely, noticing how he was shaking, how his hand clutched the edge of the table as though it was the only thing keeping him from falling apart. He had been carrying this burden for so long, and now it was like he was slowly unraveling in front of me. And yet I couldn't help but ask myself, why had he waited so long? Why had he hidden it from me for so long? 1,000 thoughts flooded my mind, each one sharper than the last. Was this his way of telling me that he didn't want us anymore? Or was it a cry for help, for me to see him in a different light? Before I could ask the question that was burning at the tip of my tongue, I heard a voice in the back of my mind. Don't run. Not yet. It was an impulse, one I couldn't explain, but it was clear. I wasn't ready to let go. And for all the pain his secret had caused, I knew deep down that I still wanted him. I didn't know how to fix this, how to take this messy, broken version of him and make it work, but there was something inside me that refused to walk away. "What do you need from me?" I asked quietly, my voice barely above a whisper. The words surprised me because I had expected to be angry, to shout, to demand answers. But in that moment, I was simply asking for the truth, not just the pieces of it, but everything. He swallowed hard, looking at me with a vulnerability that made my chest ache. "I don't know," he admitted, voice breaking. "I don't know what I need. I've spent so long trying to figure it out on my own, and now I'm scared I've lost you." He took a deep breath, his hands trembling as he reached across the table to touch mine, a quiet plea for connection in the chaos. The weight of the moment seemed to crash over me once more. I had always thought that love was supposed to be easy, that once you found someone, it was just a matter of holding on tight and never letting go. But this wasn't easy. This was messy, complicated, and raw, but perhaps that was the point. Then, without warning, his phone buzzed again, and this time it wasn't just a notification. It was a call. He glanced at the screen, his face tightening, and I saw the internal struggle play out in his eyes. The woman, the ghost from his past, was calling. I could feel the tension building between us, the unspoken question hanging in the air. What would he do? Would he pick up? Would he choose her over me? The question seemed to linger like a ticking clock, each second stretching into an eternity. He hesitated for what felt like forever before finally answering, his voice barely audible as he spoke. "Hello." I couldn't hear the words on the other end, but I didn't need to. The weight of what was happening was enough to tell me everything. He was caught between two worlds, his past and his present. And in that moment, it became clear that the woman on the other side of the line wasn't just a part of his story. She was a reflection of everything he hadn't yet reconciled within himself. And as much as I wanted to hate her, to resent the hold she had on him, I couldn't. Because the truth was, she wasn't the one who had kept him from me. I had been kept in the dark, not because of her, but because of his own fear. Fear of losing me. Fear of what it meant to be truly seen. And in that moment I realized, it wasn't just him who needed to face the truth. It was me too. I had to decide if I was willing to face all of him, the broken pieces, the past, the present, and the uncertain future, or if I was going to walk away. The seconds felt like hours as I watched him speak into the phone, his voice still trembling, a quiet apology lingering in every word. I could see the internal battle he was fighting, the conflict between two parts of himself that didn't quite fit together. I could feel the tension in the room growing thicker, like we were on the edge of something crucial, something that would either pull us apart or bring us closer than we had ever been. I didn't know if I was strong enough to face this version of him, this fragmented man whose past had suddenly come crashing into our present. The woman on the other end of the line had once been a part of him, a part that I had never even known about. and now she was pulling at the fabric of our relationship, threatening to tear it apart. But as he spoke, something changed in me. The initial sting of betrayal, the bitterness that had lodged itself in my throat, began to fade, replaced by an unexpected sense of clarity. I had spent so much time loving the idea of us, of the person I thought he was, that I had never really seen him for who he truly was. The man in front of me wasn't perfect, far from it. He was flawed, tangled up in his own fears and mistakes, and yet he was still here, still trying to navigate the wreckage of his own heart. For the first time, I realized that maybe the love we had wasn't about the perfect, seamless connection I had imagined. Maybe it was about learning to accept each other in all our messiness, in all our contradictions. He ended the call, his face falling as the weight of the conversation lingered between us. He didn't meet my eyes right away, and for a moment the room felt like it was closing in around us. But then, slowly, he looked up at me, his gaze softer now, more vulnerable than I had ever seen it. "I don't know what I'm doing," he confessed, his voice barely audible. "I've been so afraid of losing you that I built all these walls. I thought if I kept hiding pieces of myself, maybe you'd still love me. But now I see that it's not about hiding anymore. It's about being honest, about being real." His hand trembled as he reached for mine again, this time with more certainty. "I don't want to lose you," he said, his eyes pleading, his voice breaking. "But I need you to see all of me, even the parts that scare you." His words cut through the fog of confusion that had clouded my mind. For the first time, I realized just how much he had been holding back, not because he wanted to, but because he was afraid. Afraid of how I would react, afraid of what might happen if he laid everything bare. But in that moment, as I looked into his eyes, I knew that I couldn't keep pretending that everything was perfect. There was no perfect version of us, and there never had been. There was only the messy, complicated, and imperfect love we shared, and that was enough. I squeezed his hand, grounding myself in the warmth of his touch. The air between us was still charged with the aftermath of his confession, but there was something else now. Something fragile yet stronger than I had ever felt before. "I see you," I whispered, my voice thick with emotion. "All of you. Even the parts that scare me." And just like that, the walls between us started to crumble, piece by piece, until there was nothing left but the raw truth of who we were together. The love we shared, messy and complicated as it was, suddenly felt more real than anything else I had ever known. But that didn't mean it would be easy. There was still so much we needed to work through, so many pieces of our past that we had yet to untangle. But in that moment, I realized that the truth, his truth, wasn't something that would tear us apart. It was the key to something deeper, something more meaningful than either of us could have ever imagined. And as I looked at him, my heart swelling with something I couldn't quite name, I knew that whatever happened next, we would face it together. There was no going back now. The moment I realized he was the one had already changed everything between us, but it didn't mean the end. It meant we were finally free to begin again, this time as the people we were always meant to be. As the night stretched on, the world outside seemed to fade into the background, leaving just the two of us in this quiet, fragile space where everything had shifted. There was a sense of finality in the air, like we had crossed some invisible threshold, one that couldn't be undone. It wasn't the clean, neat kind of change you read about in fairy tales. There were no sweeping declarations of love or grand romantic gestures. It was messier than that, rawer. The kind of transformation that leaves you bruised but more alive. more aware of the brokenness you're willing to embrace, the flaws you're willing to heal together. I watched him carefully, noticing the way his posture had changed, the weight in his shoulders slowly lifting as we shared our truth. His eyes, once filled with guilt and fear, now held something else, a glimmer of hope, though tentative. There was a vulnerability in him that hadn't been there before, and I realized it wasn't because he had suddenly become someone else. It was because he had allowed himself to be seen, truly seen. And for the first time I could see the whole of him, the contradictions, the pain, the joy, and I didn't want to look away. I had spent so much time loving a version of him that didn't exist outside of my own expectations. But this man, this beautiful, imperfect person, was who I had always needed to love. He leaned back in his chair, his hand still holding mine, and for a moment we were silent, not because we didn't have words, but because we didn't need them. The quiet between us was no longer filled with tension or uncertainty, but with understanding. It wasn't the understanding that tied everything up in a neat little bow. There were still so many questions unanswered, so many roads we had yet to walk down. But it was the kind of understanding that allowed us to move forward, to rebuild what had been broken, to try again together. Then, almost as if on cue, a small, nervous laugh escaped him. It was a sound I hadn't heard in what felt like forever, a reminder of the lightness we had once shared before everything had gotten so complicated. I smiled, not out of relief but out of something deeper, a recognition that despite everything we still had the ability to find joy in each other. "We've got a lot of work to do, don't we?" he said, his voice low but full of warmth. "A lot of things to figure out, but I think we can do it. I think we can figure it out." I squeezed his hand again, this time with more certainty. "I'm not going anywhere," I whispered. "We'll figure it out together." The night didn't end with a perfect resolution, no neatly wrapped closure. We still had so much ahead of us, conversations to have, wounds to heal, and fears to face. But in that moment, I knew we had something stronger than any challenge that might come our way, a willingness to be real with each other, to share the darkest parts of ourselves and still choose to stay. That night, we didn't just reveal the truth, we chose it. And that choice, honestly, vulnerably, deeply, was the one that would change everything between us. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough to keep us going.